Welcome back to the Sustainable Design Lab podcast by Veritiv. I'm Brodie, Vander.
And I'm Chris Bradley. And on this show, we sit down with the innovators, the trailblazers, and the leaders who are rethinking packaging and sustainability from the ground up. At the Sustainable Design Lab, we're not just watching innovation unfold, we're cultivating it and sharing those big stories that are shaping a more circular future.
Today, we're joined by Kane and Tim Silman from Lonely Whale. They're a nonprofit that have become one of the most creative and influential forces that are tackling ocean plastic pollution. They were founded in 2015 and really were inspired by this idea of a lonely whale, the whale that, calls at a frequency that no other whales respond to, which is
sad,
compelling. Yes. And, that story really became a metaphor of, one lonely voice that can really spark a global movement.
And you've probably participated or really experienced some of the work of the Lonely Whale, even if you didn't know that that's what you're doing. So they really started with a strawless campaign to, reject plastic straws. And that kind of evolved into this Tom Ford Plastic Innovation Prize, where they got some of the biggest brands in the world to step up and say, we want to make change. So Lonely Whale has really shown that storytelling, culture, and innovation can come together to reduce plastic waste and accelerate some really exciting alternatives to plastics like seaweed-based materials, which we've been very interested in. And their programs have inspired communities, they've shaped corporate action, and it's really resulted in the testing of some of the most promising new sustainable materials on the market.
In our conversation with Emmy and Tim, we explore how Lonely Whale builds coalitions and these radical collaboration groups, how they've evaluated next generation of materials and really have used culture as a lever for behavior change on a brand scale. We'll hear from Emmy and Tim about the challenges, the breakthroughs, and what gives them hope for the future of packaging in our oceans.
All right, Emmy, Tim, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us. We're thrilled to be.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to start at the beginning. So before Lonely Whale became the organization that it is today, I'm curious if there was a moment in your life, either professionally or personally, that really helped lead you to this realization that ocean plastic crisis needed to be addressed, and specifically through innovation and collaboration with other people.
Well, for me, I always loved the ocean. I grew up in Chicago on the Great Lakes, so not necessarily ocean, but certainly was a key part of my life. And in the summers, I'd often visit my grandmother in Rhode Island. And so for me, it was just always this place of inspiration and calm and kind of rest and reset. And as I got older, I ended up at a marine biology camp and just completely fell in love with the science and the connection and, ecosystems and kind of that interconnectedness that, all these various organisms, some that are super charismatic that we know and love, and others that are a little bit under the radar and how they work together. And so I think for me, that was kind of the spark of just knowing that nature is this web that ties us all together and can be an incredible teacher as well, too, in how we live our own lives. So it wasn't necessarily innovation in plastic that led me to my work with Lonely Whale, but it was more so this place, of inspiration and kind of curiosity, essentially. And so when I first started with the team back in 2015, when we first got started, so nearly 10 years ago, we were really focused on just that. How do we build an ecosystem of like-minded folks that come from various different backgrounds, but can all kind of add in their very specific skill to broaden the conversation, specifically because in 2015 or so, there really wasn't a global conversation around plastic pollution, but we knew that there was probably kind of a through line that we could tie plastic in our everyday lives to people that come from various different walks of life to ocean health, and to really kind of get a diverse community engaged to, again, like pull their skill sets through and really create some amazing impact. So that was kind of my connection and my inspiration for working in this space.
Tim, what about you?
Yeah, well, I was going to say that, I grew up in the mountains. I'm from Vermont originally, so really had, no connection with the ocean personally, as part of my sort of experience of the outdoors and nature in general. I do have fond memories of a family vacation to Nantucket when I was, 3 years old, but the memories are just from, the pictures. I was like, oh, I look like I was having a good time. But it really wasn't part of my life, but I always have been really interested in sort of like waste and circularity, and just sort of that was sort of like a personal interest and passion. And then as part of my MBA program in sustainability and innovation, did a project with an aluminum company, and really thinking about sort of like large scale circularity around aluminum, and unlocking new sources there, and progressively have been able to work on and touch on recycling and the circular economy in different roles. And then the sort of ocean component, and being able to focus on that topic specifically as a sort of a core component of my work, we really came about through Lonely Whale, and have just gained so much more of an appreciation for it. I mean, I did spend a lot of time in living in California, so it became more and more a part of my life in terms of that connection to the ocean. But it's really unlocked a lot within me in terms of, seeing it as this sort of tremendous, mysterious resource that we don't fully appreciate as humans, and to the degree that we can like elevate it as a living sort of being, so to speak, and a symbol that we can use, not just to protect it for its own sake, but also to get people involved and engaged on sort of these broader topics around our natural world. It's been a real pleasure.
One of the things that I've been so I guess excited about the work that you've done at the Lonely Whale are some of the programs, prizes that you guys have launched. So maybe, Emmy, can you tell us a little bit about the Plastic Innovation Prize and what that was all about? And then maybe, Tim, you can talk a little bit about Unwrap the Future.
Yeah, happy to. And I think even before sharing about the prize, I'd love to just provide a little bit of context on kind of our guiding principle, so to speak, at Lonely Whale as well, because I think it helps illuminate how we even came to the prize and came to the structure that really, from my perspective, kind of gave it that secret sauce to really make it impactful. So when we got started 10 years ago, we were a very small team, a team of 3 and our 2 incredible co-founders. And we were really thinking like, gosh, how do we make an impact in the space? We're kind of the new kids on the block. We're trying to do things a bit differently, pull in the skills that, advertising agencies and others have been able to leverage on behalf of some of the largest global brands. Of course, we know that those global brands are the ones that are often using plastic, right? And so we're like, okay, what's the through line there? And ultimately what we landed on was it's a business challenge. Businesses want to use materials that will make the world a better place and make their customers happier and more inspired and live more empowered lives. So what can we do as a small ocean organization to really think thoughtfully around being a partner to those businesses and ultimately for their customers? And so we formed this concept of radical collaboration, knowing that whatever we did, we couldn't do it alone. So that was kind of always our guiding principle in the way that we structured all of our programs. So when we first got started, again, we were focused on raising awareness for single-use plastics. We did so under the banner of this For a Strawless Ocean initiative, which was a little over a year-long campaign that brought together businesses at the scale of the NFL, all the way down to your mom and pop local coffee and donut shop, to just make a commitment to actually refusing single-use plastic straws by and large for about a month, and to be able to share that with their community so that it was socialized and being able to offer solutions as well. So it wasn't just don't use a straw, it was why not use this paper one or an industrial compostable straw, or if you do need a plastic straw, let's talk about it, right? Let's talk about the accessibility nature that comes with some plastics. And so, in that instance, we were, again, focused on innovation and really focused on how do we meet businesses where they are and also bring their customers along through really inspiring and ultimately positive education. And so when we were in the face of the pandemic, 2020, spring of 2020, we had started thinking about thin film plastics as our next big challenge area. It makes up just under half of all new plastic waste that enters the ocean every year. At that time, a new report had just come out indicating that stat from Pew and Systemic. So we knew that there was a huge challenge. We knew that it was something that, was kind of on the radar for a lot of these big businesses, but how could we shift them into something new? It was going to be a bit of a different approach to what we we did with plastic straws and what we did with plastic water bottles. So we flipped the script a little bit and instead led with the need for innovation and focusing first and foremost on kind of that inspirational platform. And we're able to bring on some really incredible partners to help bring that to life, namely, the Tom Ford team, of course, through the Tom Ford Plastic Innovation Prize. But in terms of, innovation programming broadly and kind of that theory of change, Tim, I think it'd be helpful from your background experience kind of within that prize ecosystem to maybe share a little bit more too around, how we structured the program.
Yeah, and so as Emmy mentioned, I mean, I think the critical component of this work that we do is really, we need to be able to point people to the alternatives, consumers, businesses, et cetera. And I think when we were unpacking thin film as an issue area, there was a lot of interest and momentum, but not a lot of market-ready solutions that were available. So if we wanted to sort of ask businesses to do better, brands to make the switch, like we couldn't really point to something that was sort of ready to go, and there was a lot of sort of competing claims, and it's pretty opaque about like what is a environmentally sort of friendly solution. So the jumping off point was that, having come from an organization that designs and runs prizes, taking a similar sort of lens in terms of running this 2-year prize where we did a global search for solutions and had a very rigorous sort of set of criteria and protocols for evaluating those solutions. So we spent about 6 months going out globally and identifying startups and other solution providers that could participate in the competition, did a round of review, selected 8 finalists, and then those finalists actually sent samples of materials to us, and then which we then anonymized and sent off to our testing partners, which were at the University of Georgia's New Materials Institute and the Seattle Aquarium, to run through sort of set of both industry standard tests as well as a whole host of more novel methods, primarily centered on the end of life of performance of those materials. And I think both as as an environmental nonprofit, like reputationally, like we want to be very sensitive with our audience and what we're advancing as a viable solution. So having that real, sort of this huge, broad set of holistic criteria and results and data that came back gave us a lot of confidence to sort of be advocating for those solutions. And just, from a more sort of philosophical perspective, we didn't want to be putting out and advancing solutions that really, we didn't feel comfortable with and were potentially creating sort of unintended consequences in the world. So in addition to those end of life, tests that we conducted, we had a whole host of additional data we collected, had sort of multiple sort of pretty broad review bodies to select 3 winners, which we announced in spring of 2023. And then those companies went into a 1-year accelerator program. And that really was driven from my past experience in that, the prizes are great. I love prizes, but that can't be the end all be all of an innovation program, right? There really needs to be sort of a translational step of saying, okay, now that we've validated that your solution works, how do we then advance that to drive real adoption, right? Because if you just did the prize and it didn't lead to any tangible change or any sort of impact at scale, it was just sort of an expensive marketing exercise or a science fair, even as you might even say. So the accelerator is sort of a mix of a traditional venture capital type accelerator program, as well as sort of leaning on 2 sort of additional components. One is, Lonely Whale's sort of capabilities as a storytelling organization and our platform to highlight these solutions. And the other being sort of our, as Amy mentioned, the sort of radical collaboration ethos. We brought in about 20 brands that participated as sort of early adopters who committed to do a attempt of test or a trial of these materials to really, again, get at that question of translating an innovation, a new potential solution into, deployment and adoption to actually, touch consumers and be deployed in the real world. And yeah, I mean, I'm tremendously excited to see that, these things coming to life. Whether it's a capsule collection with a smaller brand or funneling into these multi-year R&D cycles that you would deal with at like a very large company that's multi-billion-dollar companies that are shipping millions of units and have extremely complex packaging challenges.
And I think what's so interesting and exciting is I remember when you came out with the results and the prize and a lot of those winners, we'd never heard of. Now they're really household names within the sustainable packaging world. So Nod Plus, Sway, Zero Circle, others that in essence, the world really learned a lot about from you. So that's pretty awesome. What is it? What criteria do you think really matters the most as far as when you're looking at a sustainable material? And it's like, is it its performance or is it its end of life in the marine environment? And how do you balance that? Because sometimes it seems like, well, it fully biodegrades in the ocean, but it doesn't have these other qualities. And how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a delicate balancing act. And I think we can't let perfect be the enemy of the good, but we also can't get behind and advocate for solutions that ultimately sort of take us in the wrong direction or potentially have like unintended consequences. Can you imagine that something that works great for actually doing its job as packaging, like protecting, a product, and really sort of gaining tons of market share and having a lot of sort of green claims behind it, but ultimately doesn't really meet those needs in terms of its end of life. Then you've sort of kind of let the horse out of the barn, I think, a little bit. And I think, in fairness, the environmental movement has been burned in the past. There's been solutions that have been elevated, like oxo-degradable materials that we've learned later. There was a lot of claims behind those, and they're not really degrading. They're just fragmenting into smaller and smaller pieces, which we're learning increasingly is even doubly bad for the environment. Which and that's a process that just normal plastics have. As it oxidizes and gets exposed to UV light and things like that, will just break into smaller micro and nanoplastic particles. So finding that right balance is really critical. I think it's important to take away, like, one of our lead advisory board scientists, who's one of sort of the marquee names in the compostable material, the history of compostable materials, just highlighted that there's an inherent tension between the service life performance, like at the job it's supposed to do when it's sort of the active packaging, and then the end of life performance. Like, there will never be a magical material that's like super strong, does exactly what you need it to do while you're using it, and then as soon as you discard it and put it into a waste stream, it just like magically disappears. Like, there's just an inherent like physics and chemical engineering tension there. So striking that right balance, I think, is really a tricky question. I would say, on the prize, really indexed more closely on the end of life of the materials, partly for the sort of reasons I highlighted, just our position as an environmental NGO and being sort of respectful of our audience and our values, but also wanting to be cautious about the solutions we advance and not sort of creating these unintended consequences. I think that more work around some of the performance, like the product performance criteria, is something that we're considering and factoring into like future innovation programs to make sure that, again, the translating the solution to impact really means that it has to be tailored to, we want to ask people to, they're going to have to make some changes in terms of tweaking sort of the requirements for how they make the packaging or what the sort of how the supply chain works a little bit, but the more it can be a drop-in solution, the faster the pathway is to scale.
And one other thing that I would add too is, as Tim mentioned, we did index pretty heavily on the end of life component, but sourcing strategy was also very important to us too. So thinking about social responsibility across the value chain was very critical. And I think, interestingly, and again, this was totally by happenstance, but all three of the prize winners were using seaweed as their feedstock, right? And so thinking about that and, having that kind of more marine and coastal economy perspective was a through line that, again, happy accident in terms of where we netted out, but really important and has certainly become a big conversation following the award of the prize with our prize winners and with a broader, kind of network of supporters as well, too.
We're big fans of seaweed packaging at the lab. We love the story of it. We love the science of it. And, fewer and fewer people who, when we say, yeah, it's made out of seaweed, who are like, seaweed? Like, what? And more people are like, really? That's so cool. And so I really feel like we're seeing this momentum and change of, not only in the industry, but also the consumer impact as well. I want to deep dive. You said radical collaboration, and I love that term. I want to deep dive specifically because Lonely Well is known for bringing what maybe would be considered unlikely partners together in what I'm assuming you mean by radical collaboration, like brands and policymakers, scientists, and even cultural leaders. I'm curious from your perspective, what makes a collaboration effective in creating real solutions and not just raising awareness or creating noise, but making a big impact?
It's such a good question, and it's a difficult question to answer because there's a different one. I think there's a different answer for every situation that you're in, right? And so I always try to think of things as, you need to develop a strategy that will effectively move whatever audience or audiences that you're looking to drive impact forward with. And I really believe it truly is a partnership. And so understanding, ultimately, is it the CSO that you're looking to sway into maybe making a different purchasing decision or to make a bold commitment to doing business a bit differently? Or is it their customer, right? And then what are the right messengers to be able to effectively tell them kind of, what is our theory of change? What is our viewpoint on whatever it is that we're trying to ultimately do together? So it changes, but I think that partnership component is critical because collaboration is it's difficult. You have to understand, where people are right now and ultimately how you can help them kind of unblock their own internal challenges in order to move things forward. Because at the end of the day, I think we really believe that folks want to do good by people and planet, but there's a lot of challenges. There's the daily commitments and other responsibilities that have to be delivered at the same time. So I think again, it's kind of understanding the audience, understanding who they are, kind of their most trusted messengers or advisors are, and then working really, really closely to understand the needs and the wants of both of those communities and being able to bring them together to make effective change.
I love that. We see a lot of that, through our work too. And I think that it's the collaboration piece is so essential to making, an impact, like you said.
Yeah. And it takes a lot of time, and I think that's something that sometimes people underestimate, right? It's like, oh, you slap someone's logo on something and that collaboration's done. And that's not the case, right? It takes a lot of conversation. It takes a lot of commitment and super transparent communication.
We see, and you mentioned seaweed, and there's lots of other things. So we often see a lot of promising materials, I would say, that really struggle because there really isn't a system that's ready. So that could be collection, consumer behavior, maybe regulations or other things that are kind of holding it back. What do you see the biggest infrastructure or policy gaps that are really holding back the scale up of some of the plastic alternatives that you've been, working on?
I think that a lot of just systems in general in this domain just kind of put too much of the onus on consumers and don't really I think there needs to be more, the imperative is really around the design of cohesive, simple systems that are designed with people in mind. And I think, the policy making is complicated, but sort of taking a step back and using some of those like human-centered design principles to understand like how are people really going to interact with and navigate these choices. I mean, I think we all here are sort of, the sort of early adopters and sort of are on the avant-garde cutting edge of sort of trying to factor in sort of messaging and different materials and knowing how to dispose of them and use them. And even we have challenges and struggles. We don't know, like, where does this material go? Like, what am I supposed to do with it? So I think some consistency and simplification will be really critical. And that, I think, holds for the alternatives themselves too, like just being really bold-faced and clear about what are you supposed to do with this and what are the claims behind it. That's kind of tackling two things, like what's the action involved and also the information there too. Because I think that we have to just be like very cautious and build this, again, not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, but also being very sort of thoughtful about how we build a durable, lasting sort of momentum and shift away from sort of the incumbent sort of fossil-based plastic materials into this realm of alternatives. And I think that requires just sort of this. It's hard. Like if you're a startup, if you're building something, or if you're a business or a manufacturer, like you have this constant churn and need to be moving, have that momentum and move forward. But there's some intentionality about sort of involving yourself to help sort of inform the dialogue about what infrastructure need to be built, how do the policies look, and how does that translate down to the consumer level, and how does that impact their behavior.
Storytelling is a piece that is woven throughout Lonely Whale's mission and success. You guys recently put out Seaweed Stories. I would love to learn a little bit more about that and how you guys have seen that really impact, the conversations that you guys are having.
Yeah. No, you're so right. Storytelling for us has been a key element, and it really goes back to that founding kind of inspiration, right, of learning from marketing and advertising agencies and how they help brands translate essentially their value proposition out to the wider world and kind of break down those elements into something that is super tangible. It's something that feels ownable for the individual consumer and that it reflects them and whatever that means, right? Like you want to be co-creating a world with your customer in their language, reflecting their your shared values essentially. And so for us, that has been a through line, and it has made our work very successful because we've ultimately been able to broaden the tent, right? It's not just us going out to other folks that are, already bought into sustainability. It's us going to folks that are maybe sports fans or maybe chefs or maybe bartenders and saying, hey, look, this is your role to play. You don't have to be an activist that's standing in the street with a sign. You can be if you want to be, but you could also be standing at the bar talking to your friend, and maybe it begins with a plastic straw and it filters out into local policy. And so those are the kinds of conversations that we've always been trying to have with our broader community, so that we can make more of a ripple effect than we can as just a small team. But in terms of Seaweed Stories, going back to some of our earlier work, we had these alternatives that were market ready, right? So from a plastic straw to an aluminum canned water bottle, alternative to a single-use plastic water bottle, those were something that we could point our audience towards and say, hey, look, go buy this or go use this instead of the traditional fossil fuel plastic alternative. In the case of the Plastic Innovation Prize, we're focusing on startups, and we're focusing on building this interest and this will for both brand leaders to make this switch, but also for customers to understand that they want this material, right? They want their t-shirts to be wrapped in a poly bag that's not fossil fuel derived, but maybe is made with seaweed. And so we really viewed storytelling as kind of that critical link in building some kind of love for seaweed that is ultimately something that not a lot of people maybe have love for. Maybe your relationship with seaweed is actually going to the beach and getting it tangled around your leg and being a little freaked out, which is totally fair. Or maybe it's just in eating, sushi. And so for us, we kind of wanted people to fall in love with seaweed as a way to then understand all of the various other potentials that the marine organism could really have. So the film Seaweed Stories is a 30-minute documentary. It goes all around the world and talks to folks that are harnessing its power in different ways. So we talk to Indigenous women out on Long Island that are actually leveraging seaweed to reclaim their sovereign right to land and to take care of their coastal ecosystem. We go to Korea and talk with an incredible scientist that's actually breeding a temperature-tolerant strain of seaweed to help his local economy actually kind of weather the storm of rising water temperatures in the country. And then we, of course, go and focus on Sway, our first place prize winner, and the incredible work that Julia Matt and her team are leading in ushering in this new wave of plastic alternatives made with seaweed as well, too. So the film itself is now out publicly, and that was really important to us as well, as how do we get this out to as many people as possible. We had the great luck of being able to place it on Leonardo DiCaprio's YouTube channel. So little plug, if you want to go take a watch, you can. It's available there. And we've had other partners help us get it out more broadly as well, too. So that includes Alaska and Hawaiian Airlines that have made some really bold commitments to reducing plastics across their airlines as well. And we hope to just continue to get the word out and to have conversations sit alongside all of these screenings of the film so that we can make it real, again, for the audiences that we're engaging, whether that's students who are thinking about their role in design infrastructure, whether that's brand leaders that are maybe making decisions around what materials to reduce or swap out altogether.
It's a great film, so I definitely recommend it. Everybody check it out. While we're talking about seaweed, what really makes it a promising material, and what barriers still exist with it, maybe technical, supply chain, or even cultural, that we're really going to need to overcome for it to reach its full potential?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I always say in the context of like traditional plastics, they are kind of a magic material because they're, super strong and they just last way too long, right? And we're causing all these other problems. And I would say the same about seaweed, that it is like kind of a magic material that we're really learning more about. But just still kind of scratching the surface. It has sort of this long history, obviously, particularly as like a foodstuff. But it's abundant. It grows without fertilizer or fresh water. It can be used to create sort of like these ocean permaculture systems that create like synergistic impacts that improve the sort of health of like cultivating oysters and clams and things like that. So it's a really like tremendous resource. And it can be broken down into these like fundamental building blocks, these polysaccharides and these other ingredients. That again, like we are really just using in only a few applications and areas right now, in addition to food. A lot of there's in cosmetics, some of the building blocks you use there, but we're really just getting started. And that's what I think is really exciting, is that there's a lot of potential in the material and lots of ways in which we could grow it. And produce more of it. I think the barriers, there's a couple I would highlight. It's grown in obviously grown in the ocean. It's inherently a hydrophilic material that it seeks sort of out water. It doesn't naturally repel water. And so obviously like barrier properties around water are key for packaging applications. So that's something that a lot of the startups, Sway and Not Planned Zero Circle, our three prize winners, have been working on really hard and finding the right applications and, really navigating some of the sort of the chemistry around that. And it's been great to see what they've been doing. I think in terms of the supply chain piece, production, as people might imagine, is centralized in Asia, but it's actually, I think, around like 95% of production comes from 4 countries. So that's a lot of centralization, and the production has started to taper off, but there's a lot of overcapacity in terms of processing. So I think there's some market dynamics that have to shake out. And this is insights that I'm not a seaweed expert, but we had a seminar during the accelerator for our prize winners with some experts on seaweed to help, kind of unpack and help them navigate some of those challenges. And I think the last, barrier, again, from a cultural perspective, as I highlighted at the outset, like seaweed is a really magical material, but people don't understand the magic, right? Like I think that that speaks to, I think, just a general sort of disconnect that people have with the ocean. We're disconnected from the real world, whether it's our food supply or where we get wood or any of these other sort of building blocks of of our lives. But, materials that come from the ocean in particular, because yes, a lot of people live on the coast, but the oceans isn't always like a part of people's daily lives or top of mind. And I think so even that makes seaweed more kind of mysterious. So I think that's a challenge, but also it's an incredible opportunity, and one in which, Seaweed Stories was one example of really trying to create a compelling narrative and unpack some of that mystery of seaweed in the ocean.
We've talked a lot about seaweed today, but there's a lot of materials I know you guys are looking into and evaluating and working with. I'm curious, for engineers, for designers, for sustainability people who are listening in, what's one practical step you would say that they could take today that, would really make a difference, maybe beyond seaweed as a packaging material?
I think that it's really key to start somewhere. And again, harkening back, perfect enemy of the good, right? Like navigating that challenge. But I think with a lot of the brands that we worked with on the accelerator and the Plastic Innovation Prize, they wanted to be working on sort of compostable materials, next gen materials in general. But they just didn't really know where to start. I think a lot, and when you're a brand and a corporation and you're setting your ESG goals, like those are necessarily like retrospective. They're backward looking. Like when you're making the goals, you can only project so much about how an industry is going to evolve. You kind of have to take what's available to you today as the solution set. So a lot of brands were saying, oh, they have, goals around, post-consumer recycled content in their packaging, which is great, right? But like, we want to be moving into sort of the future, the 21st century. We need to be thinking, a little bit more sort of beyond sort of the status quo of how we think about resources and integration of sort of more environmentally friendly packaging materials. So I think like starting somewhere and having an intentional process for doing that piloting, that analysis, building some learnings, and having a pathway to continue to build that. And I think just getting the ball rolling is a step in the right direction. Because I find that like the people that we work with on sustainability teams, packaging teams, they want to be doing this stuff, and they need a reason to start doing it. So that my sort of gauntlet that I would throw down to folks in sort of leadership positions in particular is make a commitment or support your teams to start somewhere and start doing something to try to test and learn around sort of the next generation of materials. Because eventually I think regulation and some of the ESG frameworks that a lot of companies lean on to guide some of their decision making around how to prioritize scarce resources and sustainability increasingly will reflect or incorporate some of these 21st century materials, seaweed or otherwise.
And the other element that I would say too, just to bring it back to radical collaboration, is the value of actually working with peers, whether it's peers within your company or, potentially even better, working with peers that sit alongside you at a different organization. Something that we've had the luck of is working with Veritiv actually through another program of ours that we just successfully announced the conclusion of, and that's Next Wave Plastics. And that program was really focused on building a market and a supply chain, a really robust supply chain and a socially responsible one for ocean-bound plastic. And so, Lonely Well established that initiative with Dell Technologies back in 2017. And the first thing that Dell really asked us to do is help convene other brands so that everyone could learn alongside one another in this really amazing pre-competitive way to advance the market broadly. And so I think, when we're looking at novel materials and doing things a bit differently, this is something that's a shared challenge across the industry. And so working with your peers in this way can be really fruitful and I think, help you get a little bit further along faster.
Absolutely. As we look forward towards, I would say, the future of packaging, and you guys have always seemed to be on the forefront of what's coming next. What is one thing that gives you hope? We need to sell a good story of hope for the future, and I'd love to get each of your perspectives on that.
Gosh, well, I want to provide maybe a different angle to something that's going on right now that didn't necessarily have a successful conclusion this last month. But the Global Plastics Treaty, we're seeing a lot of interest, not just within, kind of your maybe more usual characters, right, at the policy level, but we're really seeing businesses lean into this, and they're showing up and they're saying, hey, look, we want this too. We want a global treaty so that we can rise to this challenge and work together collaboratively and really usher in this new era and this new system. I think a lot of folks were maybe a bit disappointed that we didn't get to a conclusion in this last negotiating round, INC 5.2. But I would also say, if we look at kind of the history of a lot of these big global agreements, it takes quite a lot of time in order to get folks right on the same page. And there's quite a number of stakeholders when you think about plastics broadly, right? You've got your consumers, you've got your businesses, you've got policymakers. So I'm personally very hopeful that we are at the early stage of something that can be very transformative.
Where I see sort of the inspiration that I take and some of the things that give me hope is that, we talked a little bit about the 3 prize winners that we have, and there's Sway, Zero Circle, Not Blood. They're all like really succeeding in a tremendous way with compostable materials in a really muddled regulatory environment and ESG environment with like no clear incentives for brands to make the switch. Right? It's really driven by the fact that they are making great products that perform with like limited sort of concessions, right, on performance, and that they can tell a really compelling story that allow brands to sort of the brands can tap into. And that's not just in, thin film poly bags like we did with the Prize. It's also, like coated fiber applications in food service as another example. But, we would, if you talk to any investor, particularly in sort of the sustainability realm, startups need to succeed, regardless of sort of the tailwinds they might get from, regulation. That has to be sort of like a nice to have, right? It can't be predicated on some future, regulatory decision making. And all the three prize winners are really doing that, right? Like we're seeing, as Emmy said, like there's been we can take, there's glimmers of hope from INC, but ultimately we didn't get to sort of a global plastics treaty. And, the EU is sort of pivoting a little bit to focus more on competitiveness and so the the Green Deal is not getting sort of implemented at full scale. And they still have some of these rules, but they're kind of getting more rolled out a little bit more slowly. So we're not going to have this big push and sort of mandate and incentives for brands to switch to compostable materials that we might have, from those various regulatory frameworks. But we're seeing startups succeed regardless, just because they're really building great products. And so that's what I've been really inspired by.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And there are a lot of tailwinds that are frustrating sometimes. And it's great to see the resilience and the pull through by the brands. They're like, yeah, EPR might not be even giving any benefit. In fact, maybe penalizing in some cases some of these good material choices. But the progressive brands are still making those choices because they know it's the right thing to do. And that is what also gives me hope in this space. So I really want to thank you for coming on to the podcast. I think the work that you do is extremely important, and the way that you've been able to promote and incubate some of these startups that are really making a difference is really inspiring. And so we'd love to continue to stay engaged in all the different programs that you're working on and figure out how we can partner in the future.
Well, thank you for having us, and thank you for uplifting the work of organizations like ours, and likewise supporting innovators that are really changing the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Kate, thank you guys enough for showcasing your work, and looking forward to what we can build together in the future.
Sounds great.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Well, that was a really illuminating conversation. I really, there's a lot of things that are still swirling in my head as we finish. But a few takeaways that I want to talk about is really the importance of testing when they were thinking about the end of life and how they did the blind testing, sending these materials out. It's not just that they theoretically would break down, but they actually did the real testing. And then how crucial partnerships are. So when Emmy talked about radical collaboration, I thought that's such a cool idea. She talked about how they brought together science and policymakers and these big, impressive brands and startups and these communities all together. And I think the other key thing was seaweed really appeared as a hero in this story. And I think that's amazing. It's such a cool material that has a lot of promise. But it also has a cultural story and a supply chain that is really inspiring.
Absolutely. And I love how Lonely Whale really emphasizes the storytelling aspect of it. They're balancing measurable impact with creative storytelling. CB Stories is a really great example of some of their latest work that they do, and pulling together, like you said, radical collaboration across the board. It's a really great documentary. If you haven't listened to it or watched it, it's incredible. I've sent it to all my friends who are, seaweed enthusiasts to seaweed skeptics, if you will. But it's really a reminder that solving plastic pollution isn't just a technical problem, but one of culture. Communications, infrastructure, all of those pieces have to be involved when we're trying to make an impact.
So if this episode sparked ideas for you or was inspiring in any way, please follow the podcast. Share this with someone working in packaging or in innovation, and rate us wherever you listen. And this really helps others discover these conversations, which I think are so important in the future of packaging.
Absolutely. And if you're looking for more resources, case studies, or updates from our work and our work with Lonely Whale, follow us on LinkedIn or find us on sustainabledesignlab.com. Until next time.
See ya.